After the great success of the Donkey Kong franchise, with Donkey Kong 1, 2, and 3 produced by Rare in the 90s, Nintendo released Donkey Kong 64 in 1999, transitioning from the 2D standard to 3D for the first time. Following the huge success of Donkey Kong on the Super Nintendo, Nintendo invested heavily in Donkey Kong 64, hoping to meet the same expectations as the previous games. However, the future had different plans, and expectations don't always match reality, right? Some people love Donkey Kong 64, while others detest it. So why is Donkey Kong 64 bad if you belong to that group? Or why did Donkey Kong 64 succeed despite the significant challenges Rare faced in making this transition? For those who enjoyed the Super Nintendo Donkey Kong games, is it worth playing Donkey Kong 64 after all these years? We'll explore this today in a detailed and precise analysis. Stay with me until the end, as I made this video with a lot of effort and care. And know that you are free to comment on anything about all the videos here on the channel. Nintendo bet big, believing that DK64 would be a huge success, and in a way it was, selling over 5 million copies worldwide. It was the 7th best-selling game on the Nintendo 64, but the number of copies sold is half the number of Mario 64 on the same console. Nintendo even released a special version of the console in green and the game cartridge in banana yellow. The game also required the use of the Expansion Pak, which increases the console's memory. For some games like Donkey Kong 64, the Expansion Pak was indispensable. However, thinking about it, we realized that the game had high costs, which could have reduced sales. In retrospect, it would have been better not to require this device. If it was meant to improve the console's performance, what difference do you see between Donkey Kong 64 and Mario 64, for example, which doesn't need the Expansion Pak? This only served for Rare to spend more and sell less, as those without the Expansion Pak couldn't play Donkey Kong 64. Additionally, since it was Rare's first time developing Donkey Kong in 3 dimensions, they couldn't leverage anything from the previous Super Nintendo games. Rare spent about 3 years developing this game with a small team that worked hard to complete such a huge game in a short time, especially in the late 90s. Remember, Rare also produced another very famous game, Banjo-Kazooie, which we won't discuss now. However, some say that Rare reused parts of Banjo-Kazooie to make Donkey Kong 64. Why not? I doubt that games like Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie had no influence on Donkey Kong 64 and didn't reuse anything from those games. Both are open-world games, and the graphics are almost the same. So, why do some people think Donkey Kong 64 is bad? King K. Rool plans to conquer Kong Isle, and Donkey Kong and his friends are the only ones who can stop him. They must rescue their furry friends, recover the golden bananas, and save their homeland. For the first time, we can play not only as Donkey Kong and Diddy, but also as Tiny, Lanky, and Chunky Kong. Each character has unique abilities. However, it was tiresome to spend so many hours collecting items that didn't add to the game's fun experience, making you feel it was a huge waste of time well before the game's halfway point. Especially in an adventure game, where players feel like they're wasting their time, it significantly reduces the fun and the motivation to try collecting things that add nothing. I'm not saying that collectible items are bad in a game, but if not used in the right measure, it becomes a problem. Walking around a lot from one end of the game to the other just for that is frustrating and makes you want to abandon the game. Since the game was in 3D, the developer had to innovate the gameplay, adding an essential coconut launcher to fight bosses and other enemies, but this didn't add to the fun. A camera machine was also added, which I think was slightly better. The soundtrack, compared to previous games, is quite weak. Of course, this is a very personal preference, but it doesn't enhance the gameplay at all. You don't feel like playing the game just to hear the DK64 soundtrack, and the game itself is slower than it should be. I could talk about the camera, but that was an issue with many games from that era. However, without a doubt, the worst thing about this game was the number of collectibles you had to gather during the game. That's a drag. On the other hand, the game didn't stray from its essence, and I acknowledge how difficult it was for Rare to make this transition. Additionally, it's the first game in the franchise where we play with so many characters. I like well-polished games with excellent gameplay, graphics, stories, and other features that may vary by genre. But Donkey Kong 64 fails due to excess. If it had tried to work on a shorter and more precise game, we would have had a better game that would have aged as well as other games made by Rare. Remember that Sony's competitor, the PlayStation 1, was making a lot of success in the market with its large game library. Nintendo rushed to release a much-anticipated game since their previous games were so successful. This leads me to believe that Rare didn't do many tests before releasing the game to decide what could be altered to make Donkey Kong as good as they wanted. This makes a lot of sense, as Donkey Kong 64 had some bugs during gameplay, something that should have been corrected before its release. However, due to the rush, it was released prematurely. With the high budget for development and marketing, I'm sure both Rare and Nintendo expected better results from the game. No wonder Donkey Kong remained dormant until 2010 with the excellent Donkey Kong Country Returns for the Nintendo Wii, abandoning 3D gameplay. Now, it's known as a 2.5D game, and by then, Rare had been bought by Microsoft. However, Donkey Kong 64 is loved by some and unjustly disliked by others. Which group do you belong to? And after all, is it worth playing or replaying Donkey Kong 64? If you've never played it and want to have the experience and draw your own conclusions, go ahead. Visit a retro game store and buy DK64. However, since the game hasn't aged as well as other Nintendo 64 games, and there are much better games nowadays, it might be hard for you to enjoy the experience. I say this because I played DK64 a few years ago, not when 3D games were new. This made my experience different from those who played it in 1999 or the early 2000s. This contributed to my dislike of the game, and I quit well before finishing it. Thankfully, DK has bounced back, and I'm looking forward to a new Donkey Kong game, as the last one was released 10 years ago. So, Nintendo, when will you release a new Donkey Kong game for us? Comment if you agree with me or not. Do you belong to those who enjoyed the game and think it's worth playing again? Leave your comments, and I'll leave another video here for you to watch. Let's show with this video that retro games are alive and always will be. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and see you in the next video.